Okay, what we have here is a Ruger 1022 trigger assembly. Okay, the accuracy tip we're going to cover first, and probably one of the cheapest things, is the trigger assembly. This is a volt quartz and trigger assembly, and the trigger assembly is in ready to fire condition, which means the hammer's back, under tension, waiting for me to pull the trigger to release the sear and disconnector to allow the hammer to go forward. So what the trigger does, the trigger overstop screw is right here. This trigger has two things that help in accuracy. A is a curvature and then a straight line of the trigger, which aids in the pull of the trigger. It's not contoured like a normal trigger, it's actually straight up and down. This allows you to feel the trigger and aids in the pullback. It's a straight angle, so it feels more natural to pull it straight back, as opposed to a curved one, which makes you feel you want to pull up and back. Okay, the old travel stop screw, what this does is when the trigger moves rearward on a standard hammer, a standard trigger, it continues to move rearward after trigger's pulled, which means you pull the trigger, the hammer gets released, and you continue to pull until it stops, and then you let go. Well, this little motion in your finger affects accuracy. You pull more on the weapon, which every small pull, every small muscle movement decreases long-range accuracy because it's more movement to the rifle that's being transferred to it. So what that over travel stop screw does, it stops this. Once you pull that trigger and the sear and disconnector release the hammer, it stops. It only travels probably 1/4 of an inch. You can see right there, barely 1/4 inch. I'll show you. See how it stops? Any rearward movement is prevented. So once it stops and releases the hammer, sear and disconnector and hammer, the movement stops. So then you release the trigger and ready for your follow-up shot. So that aids in accuracy. Now I'm going to disassemble this component and show you the internals, the sear, disconnector, and hammer, and how they aid in accuracy. Alright, this is what's going to kind of cover with everything kind of put together on the outside of the gun. I recommend watching my trick tip on how a Ruger hammer and sear work video. That'll explain a lot more detail. But this is basically about the hammer, sear, disconnector, and I'll show you how they work in relationship. Alright, so we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit so I can show you. This is the volt quartz and hammer. So technically this would be in the ready to fire position. The hammer would be back inside the trigger assembly, trigger housing, and it's ready to fire. So you'd pull the trigger. You see how right here it released the hammer. The hammer's under tension from the spring. So it would fly forward, strike the hammer, strike the bolt assembly in the firing pin. It would fire the weapon. The bolt would come back and recoil from the firing, from the weapon firing, and it would come down and it actually presses this right there. It comes down and hits, presses, and sorry, I didn't reset it, but it would come down, hit it, and it would reset, and you'd be back into that position, ready to fire again. Those of you who are going to ask me how to make this full auto, don't ask. I'm not going to tell you. I don't want to go to jail. So I'm not going to tell you how to make it full auto. So again, you'd pull the trigger, you'd release the contact point, you'd go forward under spring tension, bang, you release, and go back normal. So that's how that works. All these parts are finely cut. The sear and disconnector aren't as long as stock sear and disconnector. The part that's right here, this lip tube, just like the hammer, this is a very fine cut and precision cut and shorter cut piece. So when you pull the trigger, there's less movement. Just like the hammer, they're following it away. So you just barely pull the trigger, 2 pounds, and the thing goes. Same thing with the disconnector in the inside. I wish I had a glass trigger to really be able to show that, but no can do. Anyways, so this part is actually finely polished. So when you pull the trigger, there's very little movement. These 2 connection parts in here are very, very tight. Very, very minimal contact. That all creates a lighter, smoother trigger. Like the hammer, I polish, you can see, all the contact points. I'm very careful, but I polish them all. Inside here too. This you don't have to worry about. This doesn't really do anything other than come back in contact with a hammer. But it's the contact points between this sear and the hammer, and in here, the sear and the disconnector. It's like a little J hook in there. Those are the parts you want to polish. Okay? Okay, the next component we're going to talk about is the first thing you should do to make your rifle more accurate. It's the easiest thing to do, and it's the hammer. What I laid out right here is a diagram, and I tried, guys, to make it as simple as possible so the basic person can understand this. We're going to use a clock system, like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, etc. The only difference between a volt quartz and target hammer, the main primary difference, which is the accuracy between a volt quartz and target hammer, match hammer, and a stock Ruger hammer, is the angle of the cut. You see right here? That cut right there? It's the angle in which the degree is cut. That's what lightens the trigger pull with the hammers. So we have the clock system here. 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Okay, on both the hammers. Okay? The angle of the cut, as you can see here on the stock Ruger, as it comes down, it angles in, and then this is the cut. This is the part where the sear and the sear grabs onto as far as the hammer. So when you pull the trigger, which I'll demonstrate later, it breaks this plane and the hammer is allowed to go forward. So see how this cut is like more towards like the 5 o'clock or more up pitched towards this way? That's a stock hammer. That's why the hammer is really heavy. The match grade ones, the cut, as you can see, is more angled down. So you have on paper, see the cut's more angled down this way. So it's a lighter pull. So when the sear gets a hold of that, it's barely holding onto it. So when you pull the hammer, pull the trigger, hammer disconnects, and sear, blah, blah, blah. And then it comes down, and this is a lighter trigger pull. That's the only difference. The hammer's a little bit heavier, and more. I polish my hammers for, so everything's a little bit smoother, but they come polished. But I just do a little extra. But that's the main difference, is the angle of the cut. So I'm going to show you how to cut it yourself, so you can take your stock hammer from this and make it look like this, using a few simple tools around the house, or you can get it to your hardware store. But that's it. That's the only difference. Okay, tools to cut the hammer. These are your basic tools. There are other tools you can use, but these are what I use. I've gotten it down now to where I can actually use a Dremel. Obviously the Dremel's not attached, with a cutting blade. And what I do is I obviously attach the Dremel to a Dremel, and I put this in a vise. And I know now, because I've done so many, what angle I slowly cut and cut and cut until I get to the proper angle. I know the angle now by heart, so because I've done so many, now I know exactly where to cut in straight. If you choose to use this method, or any of these methods, you want to test your system out. So basically you want to do a significant cut, and then reassemble your trigger assembly and pull the trigger and see how light it gets. And it'll get lighter and lighter the more you cut at the angle we previously talked about. That's one way, is you Dremel. That's way advanced. I wouldn't recommend that for the entry level guy, because you'll probably end up ruining your hammer. The next is a sanding block. There are several different types of sanding blocks that have very fine edges, and what you can do is you just start sanding. Obviously this will be in a vise, and you do nice even strokes. And sand, 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 until you get the angle down to where you want it, reassemble, pull the trigger, and see the tension in the hammer, and it'll get lighter. So basically sand this down until you are happy with where the trigger pull is. I don't recommend going down below 2 pounds because then it's dangerous because you're lighting the trigger up too much, and that's how accidents happen and people get killed or shot. So be careful how you cut it. And then there's a fine file system. These are metal fine files. They're kind of expensive. These are like $30 for fine metals, but they're angled. This is a tri-blade, and you have a quad blade, and you can see they fit perfectly right in the groove. So again, you'll be in a vise, use your fine file, and you just watch the angle of your blade as you're cutting and you're filing, evenly, even strokes, and you file it again like any of the others. You file it down to the angle you like. So when you reassemble it, keep pulling the trigger, keep reassembling it until you get the angle that you like. Alright, now there's another thing I want to cover, and I will grab the buffer materials. Hold on one second. Alright, we're going to cover the polishing wheel and polishing compound. So as you can see on this Ruger stock bolt, it's kind of shiny because I polished it. What I do is I attach the polishing buffer to a Dremel, put polishing compound on it, and you just basically you're buffing all the imperfections out of the hammer. One word when you're polishing, you want to go against the hammer. So basically you don't want to go, if the wheel's turning this way, like counterclockwise, don't do that. Because you can deburr, or you can actually buff off part of your lip, which will basically you wasted all the fine filing you did. So you want it going clockwise that way to buff it. That way you don't round off that edge. And you basically buff that part right there to where it's nice and shiny. Now if you want to be a super Poindexter crazy accuracy nut, you can also buff, as you can see I have right here, buff any point in the trigger assembly that has friction. So basically you want to buff that out too. This one really doesn't matter the direction, but you'll make sure you buff evenly. So that's a friction point, and that's a friction point. You smooth out friction points, it smooths up the trigger pull. So basically you want to do the curvature right there, buff there and buff there on the hammer. Just like I did on the Volquartsen. Volquartsens actually come pretty buffed. They're actually really good. But I'm an accuracy freak and it's a hobby of mine, so I take myself seriously. So I actually buff the hell out of all the contact points. Friction points.